That song we just saw was from The Wiz, a version of the presentation of Wizard of Oz. And what's a little bit different about The Wiz is it takes place in an urban setting rather than a rural setting. And it's an African-American woman who is already an adult, who's living with her adult aunt and uncle. So the context has changed a little bit from the classic Wizard of Oz that many people may be familiar with. The reason that I wanted us to start from that place with this particular version of Dorothy is that today's talk is about a love that requires no defense, about living from a place that is defenseless rather than being so defensive. It's very easy in these times to feel on the defensive. At least for me. I don't know, does anyone else ever find that they are backed into a corner or feeling defensive about circumstances?
Ever talk to those people?
Even talking with other people, I think that we had a big event, and one of the reasons, again, for asking Mykal to show that reading about the teacher seeking to know the knowledge about the students, and having done that ever since Columbine, we're in this week where there was the largest mass shooting in the United States. Just not in a wartime, but in a time ostensibly of peace. A time when someone could get 23 different weapons up into a hotel room 32 floors high and make very serious plans about harming others. So even in a time where we have people attacking other people, the idea of setting down our defenses may seem very counterintuitive. The invitation to love in a non-defensive way is about opening to more greatness than we've necessarily been open to. And I think the story of The Wiz, I think the story of the Wizard of Oz provides a lovely mythology, a lovely story to explore that kind of vulnerable openness to our own magnificence. And those are really the key points that I want us to take away. How do we celebrate and recognize our magnificence? How do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable? And from that magnificence, how do we sense our connection to divinity that is always happening, ongoing, moment by moment by moment? As I look around the room, how many people have ever heard the story of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz? Okay. Dorothy, at the beginning of the story, may seem a little bit lost. She's at home, but she's a little bit lost. Things aren't going in a way that she would imagine, in a way that she would desire. Again, I would ask, has any of us ever come to a point in our lives where we feel like our lives are going on in a way that isn't exactly what we want? So there's a little bit of chuckling here. One of the things is for each of us to have come to that point, for each of us to have come to the idea that our lives should be a certain way, somehow we've bought into a story that life should be a certain way. The person who wrote about the ideas for the talk this week used the words domesticated. We've been domesticated into believing in a certain way of being. I think one of the pieces about arguments that have gone on this week about what happened in Las Vegas. there's domestication. Some people are saying, well, look, these automatic and semi-automatic and weapons that have been automatized point to something that is not particularly safe. Why is that needed? It's been a time that some people have said, maybe now is a time that we might want to talk about how we work with weapons and how we hold the idea of weapons in our community. And another side that is very much more pro-weapons, it's like, now's not the time to talk about gun control. Not the time. And there's a story connected to there why it's not the time. The notion that everybody is entitled to bearing arms goes back historically to the point when really the United States got launched. Because one of the things that was happening historically back then was that people weren't supposed to have arms. They were supposed to have paid taxes for their arms. And as many of you may know, the origins of the United States came from a bunch of people that didn't want to be paying taxes. And in fact, in response to their not paying taxes, the King of England decided that not only was he going to have people pay taxes, that he was going to militarize the whole area as a way to enforce the idea of taxes. So not only would you feel like unfriendly about the notion of paying taxes, now that king, who lived way, way far away, was saying, I've brought in some army people. And you know what, Reba? They're going to be living with you. And you're going to be feeding them. And you know that extra room you've got? You're going to be having 2 or 3 soldiers there. And Charlie, I don't know about you, but if you've got a little bit of cupboard space, you get to have the cupboard space and my soldiers are going to be there. So historically, there is this story that's been laid down about the importance of why we should bear arms. The reason that I'm going back to this story is that oftentimes when people hold a particular viewpoint, we don't look for the story that's behind their what it is that they're holding is so important. When Dorothy is feeling lost, the family isn't looking at what it is that has Dorothy feeling lost. And the problem is that we're often taught that it's the people that we love, that it's the circumstances around us, that we need those external explanations. We're given these stories so that we start to have maps about external explanations. One of the lovely things about the story of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is that the world literally drops out from under her feet. As you know, she is carried to Oz in an extraordinary way. And when her house lands and it really upsets the way things in Oz are working. You saw at the end of that video that she had those beautiful silver shoes, and you saw her tapping them. The silver shoes were a treasure of the person that ruled where she landed. And she was a ruler, and her sister was a ruler. And her sister believed that she should have gotten the shoes. But the shoes didn't go to the sister. The shoes went to Dorothy. So you're familiar with the fact that Dorothy was wandering around in a pair of shoes that didn't belong to her.
I didn't know that. Is that from one of the Wicked Witches?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Wicked Witch of the East. Her shoes were Glinda the Good Witch in one story, and I think it's Apanad, or they have another name for the Good Witch in The Wiz.
Mm.
She bestows the good shoes on Dorothy.
Mm.
So Dorothy is stepping out in another person's shoes. Now, what a lovely metaphor. How often are we willing to step into another person's shoes? She has this entire journey in another person's shoes? How often are we willing to step into another person's shoes? One of the ideas associated with the science of mind from Ernest Holmes is that the shoes that we are filling out, we are a place where the divine shows up. Let me read it to you. We arrive at a consciousness of unity only in such a degree as we see what we are looking for, we are looking with and looking at. If we dare to throw ourselves with abandonment into a seeming void, we would find our feet firmly planted on a rock. In the mentality, in the heights of its greatest realizations, we come to the supreme moment of realization where we merge with the universe. But not to the loss of our individuality, where a sense of oneness of all life so enters our being that there is no sense of otherness. It is here that the mentality performs seeming miracles, because there is nothing to hinder the whole from coming through. From letting the whole coming through. Each of us is a place through which the divine is present. Now, at the beginning of the story, Dorothy doesn't get that. And in fact, one of the things that's a little bit compelling about Dorothy's story is that as she's going on this road, she encounters people who seem equally lost about themselves on their path. She comes to the Scarecrow, whose biggest complaint, whose chief problem, is that he doesn't feel like he's smart enough. I don't know about you, but I know that there have certainly been times when I don't feel that I am smart enough to contend with the circumstances I'm facing. And yet, as you follow Dorothy in connection with the Scarecrow character, he is consistently brilliant. He's the one with all of the ideas. He's the one who's able to offer ultimately some direction. You know, he starts, which way should I go? He's not sure, but he's able to get through that. Each one of us may feel that we don't know. Again, we may have been given stories so that one story says that we should go this way, another story says that we should go this way, and which story do we listen to? How do we pay attention to the stories that are facing us? To the stories that have been fed to us, to the stories that we have swallowed whole, and that we might not have taken time to digest. The thing that Dorothy and the Scarecrow have in common is that they both know what they want. They've both taken the time out to figure out what do they want. Dorothy, oddly enough, for feeling at lost when she was home, suddenly realizes she wants to go home. That song is realizing, that's where I really wanted to be. There was a miraculous quality in my life that I never paid attention to, and yet it was there. And that's really where I want to go. Can I take what I've learned here back? Is that possible? The Scarecrow knows that he wants to have a better capacity for solving problems, for thinking. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the story, the next character they come into contact with is the character of the Tin Man. And what does the Tin Man want? The Tin Man wants a heart. Now, what you may not know, unless you've read the Frank Baum books, is, do you know why the Tin Man wants a heart? Do you know why the Tin Man doesn't have a heart? No. So, okay, so nobody can say, so I can virtually say anything and anybody. But in the story, what you find out is that the Tin Man had been cursed by the witch and he had engaged in a series of actions that had harmed himself, so that his living physical body had to be replaced by the tin. And it was because there was a jealousy about the Tin Man wanting the object of his love was something that was denied to him. One of the things that I think is striking is that when Frank Baum was writing the story of The Wizard of Oz, these characters had a very specific political representation. And yet, the thing about the Wizard of Oz, and as I heard your how often do we find ourselves sacrificing pieces of ourselves, believing we're in the pursuit of love? How often have we said, oh, I'll give that up so that I can love this person? How often do we find that we literally chop off an element of who we are in order to love? And at the end of that process, do we even have a heart left? The Tin Man's story is no. As all of the parts of the Tin Man were replaced, that heart was forgotten. So what does the Tin Man want? He wants his heart. He wants his capacity to love back. For though even in spite of having given up himself, he still values love. He still values love. The third person, the third one that they encounter, is the character of the Cowardly Lion. Now, the Cowardly Lion, how many of us have ever felt that we needed a certain amount of courage? We needed to be a certain way. We needed to act a certain way to be acceptable. The irony of the Cowardly Lion is that the expectation is that a lion is bold. A lion is courageous. A lion is fearless in the face of danger. And yet Frank Baum's character is cowardly, is afraid. I don't know about anyone here, but I know that there have definitely been times when I have been fearful. I know that there have been definitely times that I have not known how I would have everything I needed to go forward. Yet in spite of the fear, the Cowardly Lion joins in. The Cowardly Lion's willingness to join in is an act of vulnerability. And I would say that that notion of vulnerability is a powerful element about how to use love. Lessons in terms of love so far are, do we know what we want? Dorothy and the Scarecrow both knew that they knew what they wanted so that they could go forward. To love, do we know what we want? Are we willing to look and consider what we want? The lesson from the Tin Man is, even though we may have sacrificed, even though we may have lost, are we willing to keep going? Are we willing to continue to have heart when it might seem crazy? Because if our heart's been broken, why would we possibly want the heart back? And the Cowardly Lion, are we willing to be vulnerable? You may know the story. They land up in the Emerald City. They encounter the great and powerful Wiz, the Wizard of Oz. And he's not immediately forthcoming with providing them what they want. Have we ever in our lives gone to a place where we thought we would get what we wanted? We thought this person had promised that if you do this, it'll all be right. They arrive, we're here, we're at Santa's workshop. We've said what we wanted. We've made our list. And they're like, nope, you're not getting that. You have to do a little something for me. And the wizard wants them to bring back the broom of the Wicked Witch. But they're like, well, she's not going to give it up without a fight. Yep, I know. We might even have to kill her. Yep, I know. Sometimes we're given an impossible task. Sometimes love can feel like an impossible task. And that's where I believe the key lies. Because what's impossible for humanity is not necessarily impossible for the divine. The divine makes connections. The great universe, the great mother, however you want to characterize that source of all life, there are connections and things going on that our conscious minds may never understand. As long as we try to stick with the scarecrow and be able to understand everything in a logical fashion, we're going to end up banging our heads and wishing our heads were made of straw because we've been banging so hard. Sometimes the actions of love are about leaning into mystery. Sometimes it's about becoming vulnerable and letting something come through us. Letting something greater than ourselves use us. Now again, in the story of The Wizard of Oz, those four characters, Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, the Lion, they don't march triumphantly into the witch's castle and say, hey, give us your broom, we're here, we're great, we've come a really long ways, we want the broom, come on, give it over. It doesn't happen that way.
Flying monkeys.
Flying monkeys. I don't know about you, but has anyone ever had a flying monkey come into their path? I mean, I remember when I was little, the scenes of those flying monkeys, I had a record and I would replay. When I was little, The Wizard of Oz would come on like once a year. Mm-hmm. And I could watch it on television and would watch it because it wasn't the same generation that we have now. I couldn't YouTube bits and pieces of The Wizard of Oz and see the whole thing. I couldn't check out Netflix or Hulu or there wasn't a video store that had it. Video didn't exist. It was a once-a-year thing, so I had the record album, and I would play that, the soundtrack, over and over again. And every time there was the soundtrack of those flying monkeys coming out, I would run and I would hide. I was as cowardly as the Cowardly Lion. In fact, one time I hid under a table that is now in our hallway, and it's a table that has it folds on top of itself, but it would stand up, and if you put it against a wall, it's this interesting shape. It's a scalloped shape tabletop, and you can roll it all the way back so that it folds into a larger table. But it's like a little bit like a desk, and it had this back. And my mother had my grandmother's Czechoslovakian crystal lamp on top of this. One time I was running to hide under the thing, I hit the tabletop slammed shut, the Czechoslovakian crystal lamp was crushed underneath it. So not only was the Czechoslovakian crystal lamp demised, you know, this beautiful mahogany piece that my mother had was, well, you know, crystal and mahogany. It's those two things aren't a great thing, you know. And you know, I remember my mother sobbing, you know, because her beautiful antique crystal Czechoslovakian crystal lamp was now Czechoslovakian crystals, broken glass, and her table now had significant scarring and maiming in it, and
all because of monkeys.
all those monkeys.
See, the monkeys are bad.
So something that is fearful, just in the mind, you can see it can have big effects in the world. How many of us find that we get fearful about things that we may never actually encounter?
Oh, I suppose.
Oh, yeah.
And how many of us find that that orientation towards those things doesn't necessarily bring a better world? It doesn't necessarily bring more love into the world. It brings less. So the flying monkeys, what they did is they took out the straw for the scarecrow. So the scarecrow was left unable to do anything because the straw scattered all over the place. And the Tin Man, his little bits and pieces have been scattered all over the place. And Dorothy and the lion end up locked in the witch's home.
Those are some strong monkeys.
Those are strong monkeys. So I do believe, well, you know, the witch actually has Toto, but circumstances happen that the Tin Man is able to recollect himself and get the straw man stuffed with enough straw that they can make their way to the castle. In order to overcome the witch, it isn't in attacking her. Dorothy is merely trying to defend the scarecrow. And in that defense, she takes the water and throws it on the witch, and the witch dissipates in the water. So they've done their job. They go back to Oz, only to discover that the wizard isn't really all that great and powerful. He's just a person. But he does agree that he will take Dorothy home. But the problem is that his balloon takes off before she's able to leave. Now, as you saw at the end of The Wiz, after she sung that song, she clicks her heels 3 times, and then she's back in the urban setting outside of her house. There's a point in the story of Harry Potter. Harry Potter has finally confronted Voldemort, and Voldemort has sliced him down. And Harry Potter has gone to this kind of midway place. It ends up being King's Crossing train station. And he's met by Dumbledore, who's been killed. And Dumbledore explains everything that's happened. And Harry Potter is left with a choice. Do I go back? Or do I go on? And Dumbledore's like, well, it's your choice. It's your choice. Dorothy had the same thing. It was her choice. We're all left with that same thing. It's your choice. Harry, though, right before he goes, he said, was any of this real, or did it all happen in my head? And Dumbledore said, well, why, my dear boy, if it happened in your head, would that make it any less real? So often we try to divide the world into what's real and what's real. It's been well shown that people can improve their ability to hit to get a basket, a ball through a basket, just by seeing it. That by doing it in the mind, it does it. There's this great commercial where the girl takes these stick-it notes, these post-it notes, and each day she jumps up and she puts it up. And she writes on the note, higher. That's the one word she uses, higher. And each day you see her doing that, and each day she's getting higher, and each day she's getting higher. And then you see one day she's in gym class, and there's this basketball hoop, and the gym teacher says, okay, who wants to try first? And she's like, oh, I'll go. And they'll look at her because she's kind of short, and she doesn't look particularly athletic, and she, goes up and she nails it, to everyone's surprise. The thing about love, when we're willing to make ourselves vulnerable, when we're willing to admit our own magnificence, and finally, when we're willing to actually see that we are already all that the divine is right where we are, it's at that point that we can stop defending. It's at that point that we can simply be who we are. And I would invite us to consider that that's what loving is. Loving is truly embodying ourselves. And that capacity to truly embody ourselves really amounts to those three things. It amounts to recognizing our magnificence, recognizing that this life that we have, and again, I don't know about you, but I will sometimes make comparisons about my own capacities. I'm not as good. I didn't do as much. I didn't achieve as much. I didn't succeed as well. I'm not able to. I'm not. If we can turn that around and stop paying so much attention to what we can't do and pay a little bit more attention to what we are doing, there's a power in that. There's a claiming. There's that message that Marianne Williamson and that Nelson Mandela spoke, that it's our brilliance that the world is calling for, not our smallness. It's our magnificence. And it takes vulnerability to say, I am that. It takes vulnerability. It took vulnerability for Dorothy to open up and say, well, I don't have everything I need, so I'm going to this other place. And she got joined. And she became pretty formidable. Individually, Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, individually, they were a bunch of kind of caricatures. They weren't really very whole. But taken together, they became something more. By opening our vulnerabilities, we become something more. And letting something come through us that is bigger than us empowers us in a way that we may never have imagined as possible. Therefore, I invite us to consider letting down the defenses, opening to our magnificence, opening our vulnerability, and letting the divine, Sophia, Spirit, God, whatever name we want to use, to let it move in, as, and through us. And so it is.